welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm doing a wrap up for all of the books that I completed in the month of May. So May was a phenomenal reading month for me. I actually completed 9 books, and I also read a few short stories out of a short story collection. So that makes 10 books, even though I didn't finish it. I'm still kind of counting it. And then I also finished a couple books with my daughter for school, which I'm not really going to be wrapping up here. I have not done that so far this school year at all, included any of the books that we're reading for school, because I don't know if that's of interest to any of you. So if it is, let me know and maybe I'll include those in the future. I am hoping to do kind of a wrap up of the best books that we read in 5th grade, like our favorite books, because I did that for 4th grade and that was really fun and a cool way to reflect. So I'm hoping to do that again this year. Anyways, out of the 10 books that I did read, 5 of those 10 books were 5-star books, which is incredible. And my lowest rated ones were in the 3 to 3.5 range, and that was only 2 of them. So I had an amazing reading month, nothing below 3 stars, no DNFs. It was really great. So I'm really excited to share with you what I read for this month. And I'm gonna go in ascending star order, I think, which a lot of times I don't do that. A lot of times I'm not that organized, but I'm gonna be organized today. Okay, so my 2 3 or 3.5 star reads are both, unfortunately, books that I read for Ellen Montgomery, which is a readathon that I hosted with some lovely ladies during the month of May, where we focused on the works of Ellen Montgomery. So I read from the Against the Odds short story collection, and I enjoyed the ones that I read, but they weren't really stand out and they didn't really stick with me. So while they were fun, they were just kind of like light and fluffy, but I didn't read that many of them. I only read a few, and I would like to dip back into this because I had several of my co-hosts for Montgomery say that their favorite thing that they read were short story collections. And this is not one of the short story collections that either of them read, but they said, you know, some of them were fine, but some of them were like amazing and really, really good, and made it one of their favorite things to read. So I hope to dip back into this at some point, even though I didn't read a ton of them during the month of May. I also read for our group read Kilmeny of the Orchard, which is one of Ellen Montgomery's standalone books. She doesn't have a ton of them. A lot of them are duologies or trilogies or just series in general, but this is a standalone that follows a young man named Eric who has just come out of college, and he's helping out a friend because something's happened with his friend and his friend's unable to finish up teaching the school year. So he tells his friend that he will teach for whatever, I think it's like 4 or 6 weeks left, and he ends up in this town and it's really boring and nothing really to do there, and he ends up going for a walk, ends up in an orchard, and hears this beautiful violin music and stumbles across the lovely Kilmeny, who then kind of runs away from him, and he learns kind of her mysterious past and gets to know her and all of that kind of stuff. We did host a group discussion for this book, and so I will link that. It's around an hour long, but there were things about this book that I really didn't like and really bothered me, and chatting with some of the ladies about this helped me kind of to reframe some of that a little bit and appreciate some things in it that I didn't really appreciate before. So I'm really happy that I read this. I think I landed on a 3.5 for this because usually a 3-star means that it was fine, but I probably would never reread it. I could see myself rereading this one at some point, but as of right now, it is my least favorite Ellen Montgomery book that I have read. So there's that. I did love the nature writing, so I love Ellen Montgomery's writing in general. I should also mention that both of these books, in addition to several other books that are in this reading wrap up, I talked about in a reading vlog that I did earlier in the month of May. So I will link that reading vlog, and then in the description below, I'll kind of put in parentheses which of these books I did read during this reading vlog, because there were several that I started and finished, and one that I didn't start during it but did finish, and so I have a lot more in-depth thoughts about those books there if you're interested in hearing that. So moving on to the 4-star category, the first book that I'm going to mention here is The Shadow Line by Joseph Conrad. I read this with my friends Tia and Sandy. This is my second Conrad that I have read. Earlier this year I read Heart of Darkness, And I found through both of these works that are very, very different that I just absolutely love Conrad's writing style. His descriptions are lush and vivid, and I just love the way that he writes. So this was a very enjoyable reading experience for me, although it was completely different from Heart of Darkness. The Shadow Line basically deals with an unnamed narrator who is a young man who has, for no other reason other than he feels like it, quit a really good job that has a position on a boat that he's working on. He just decides, I don't know, I'm just gonna quit and go home. I just feel discontent. But in between the time when he quits and before he's able to go home, he actually gets assigned to be the captain of a ship whose captain has just died. The entirety of the story is focusing on the narrator's journey from youth and immaturity and irresponsibility to adulthood. He's crossing the shadow line from youth into maturity. And I felt like that was really well done in this book. I felt like there was a clear trajectory. I felt like you could really see the character's growth, particularly in how little he cares about things at the beginning and how he ends up really taking ownership of this ship and the things that happen on it, and his work ethic totally changes. And so I felt like it was very effective in communicating that and speaking to something that all of us have experienced at some point in our life where we finally like kind of crossed over that threshold into adulthood. And for many of us, there was a defining event or a defining moment where we realized that we had done that. And so that's kind of what the narrator is conveying in this story. However, there were things about it that I wish that he had expounded upon more. Some of the characters were really interesting, and there's a little bit of mystery surrounding some things that are happening on this ship and things that have happened to the previous captain, and you're kind of wondering, is this going to take a mystery turn? Is this going to take possibly a supernatural turn? And none of that really has any follow through, unfortunately. And I wish that it had, because I think that the plot could have been much more interesting, but I don't think that the plot was really Conrad's primary purpose in this work. I think that he was really just looking to convey that process and that idea and that thought of going from youth to maturity and crossing over that shadow line, which I do feel like he did effectively. So I really enjoyed it. I think I liked it more than both Dia and Sandy, but I do still think it could have been better as well. The next 4-star book that I completed is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I read this with my friend Whitney. We're currently reading through the Stormlight Archives, and I had some people recommend to me to read Warbreaker in between Words of Radiance and Oathbringer. So we read Words of Radiance together in April and then Warbreaker together in May. And I really enjoyed this. This is not technically part of the Stormlight Archive, but it is part of Brandon Sanderson's like greater Cosmere. So it's a world within this universe that he has created. And I found it to be a really, really fun read. The primary people that we're following are really 2 sisters who have grown up, they're princesses, and they've grown up in this society that's very controlled and kind of repressed in a way, I guess, because they only wear plain colors, and the girls have the power to change the color of their hair. In fact, their hair color actually changes with their emotions, and the oldest sister has learned to control that so that doesn't really happen. And so there's a lot of control and not much indulgence in the kingdom that they grew up in. And the oldest daughter has been betrothed to the god king of a neighboring city / kingdom. And basically the reign there are all these people who are considered gods because they have died and then they kind of like miraculously came back to life, and they call those people the returned. And then they have become gods and have like, you know, they have like a court of the gods where they make decisions and stuff. And over all of them is one who has the most power, and he's the god king who the daughter is betrothed to. So at the last minute, the father makes a different decision and decides instead of sending his oldest daughter, he's going to send his youngest daughter, despite the fact that his oldest daughter has spent her whole life training and preparing for this marriage. And so as you might imagine, things are turning out a lot differently than anyone had anticipated. And so it's just really interesting to follow the characters. I found the magic system and the world itself to be really interesting and a little bit more straightforward than the magic in the Stormlight Archive. It was easier for me to follow, and the story and all of those kinds of things in themselves was a lot more simplistic, which was really nice because I feel like Stormlight requires a lot more brain energy from me just because it's a much more massive scale than Warbreaker. Warbreaker is technically right now a standalone, but Sanderson has said that he plans to write a sequel. But some of the characters from Warbreaker are in Words of Radiance, and I'm assuming will also show up in Oathbringer and subsequent books as well. So it was kind of fun to see the connections there, and I just thought it was a lot of fun. It's not a new favorite for me because there were elements to it that I didn't particularly enjoy. In fact, I found some of the content in it, particularly the sexual content, to be pretty cringy, honestly. And it's not like very detailed or anything like that. It just feels like very male gaze oriented in the way that things are described, and most of Brandon Sanderson's books have little to no sexual content in them, so this one just was a little bit more just because the Court of the Gods is just kind of very indulgent in their society in general, so that's just a part of it. And like I said, it's not really descriptive or anything like that, but the parts that are there just felt really cringy to me, and that kind of like pulled me out of the story entirely. I just didn't really like how it was written. So I enjoyed it. It's not a new favorite, but it was still a really solid 4 stars for me. The next 4 star, I'm torn because is it a 4 star? Is it a 4.5 star? Is it a 5 star? I feel like after finishing it, it's not a 5 star, but I could see in time in my mind it reaching the level of 5 stars, or upon a reread being a 5 star, because I can see that it's a masterpiece. And you guessed it, I finally finished Middlemarch by George Eliot. So this is a book that was really intimidating for me. It's on my classics TBR for the year, and it's one that I wanted to read, but scares me because of its scope and its length. And there's a lot to it, even though it basically follows this small town. There's a lot of drama and politics and different things that are happening, and interpersonal relationships, and lots of family drama, and most of the people seem to be related in some way. And so there's a lot of characters to keep track of. And when I started this book, I think at the end of March, when I started it, I really enjoyed the first book because we're really zeroed in on Dorothea Brooks, who is one of the main characters in this story. And she's a young lady who is very devout and religious, super intellectual, and she's really interested in marrying a husband who can further her intellectual desires and needs in a time period where that was really frowned upon for women. And so she finds someone she wants to marry who's a lot older than her, but is a scholar, and she just really wants basically the excuse of helping him to be able to learn Greek and Latin and all these things that she really wants to know. But after book 1, then we zoom out on the rest of the town, and I felt really overwhelmed for a while because there were so many characters and I kept confusing them. For example, at the end of book 1, we are introduced to Ladislaw. And then at the beginning of book 2, they introduce us to Lydgate, and I thought that the two were the same person for a while because of the L names, I guess. But I ended up really enjoying this book. I enjoyed a lot of exploration of characters. I was reading this with Stephanie and Kate, who are still working their way through it, so I'm still hearing their thoughts, which is really fun. But Stephanie said that one of the things that she loved about this book is how flawed and real the characters feel, which is not something that you always find in a Victorian novel. Sometimes it's like the women are all just kind of like these one note, like sweet, innocent, wonderful people, and the men are all heroic, or, you know, like sometimes they just feel very flat, one note, and unrealistic. And these feel like real, messy people. And that was something that I really enjoyed about it too. There's a lot of complexity to a lot of the characters, which I really liked. But I feel like this book could also be subtitled Why Premarital Counseling is a Good Idea. Because there's a lot of people in this book who get married and they're very discontent in their marriages because they wanted different things from these marriages. And if they had talked about what they were looking for in a marriage before they got married, they could have avoided a lot of trouble by at least knowing that they differed, and at most maybe choosing not to be together because they had completely different goals in mind. So there were moments of frustration in this book. There were characters that frustrated me at the beginning that towards the end I grew quite fond of, but there are characters in this book that I never warmed up to. I never liked Will Ladislaw. I'm just saying, there's never a point I felt sorry for him. There was never a point I liked him. at any point in this book. And I didn't really like Rosamund, even though she does exhibit some growth at the end of the book. I still just really didn't like her. So that kind of impacts my rating a little bit because of some of the way that it ends. But I do think that it ends with one of my most favorite quotes that I have ever read in literature. And it says, "For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." And I love that. Felt like it was the perfect ending to this book. I definitely feel like it's a masterpiece, well worth reading, and I'm really looking forward to reading more George Eliot because this is the only the second one of hers I've read, and I own like 3 or 4 more books from her. So I really hope to read more of her books soon. Moving on to 5 stars, because like I said, I have 5 5-star books this month. So the first of which is The Queen of Ebenezer by K.B. Hoyle. This is another one of those books that I read in that reading vlog. This is a YA book that is published by Owl's Nest Publishers, who I absolutely love. They put out middle grade and YA books. They're an indie publishing house that were founded by K.B. Hoyle and also Katie from Life Between Words, who used to have a really active booktube channel and not quite so much now, but she is still one of the co-hosts for Middle Grade March. So when I found out that Katie had started a publishing house with someone, I was like, I need to get into some of that. So this is actually the 3rd K.B. Hoyle book that Owl's Nest Publishing has put out, and I've read all 3 of them. And I really, really, really love this one. So like I said, this is a YA, and it follows a girl named Bee who wakes up in a swamp and has no memory of how she got there or of her life beforehand. And she meets this boy named Tom, I think, who is the self-proclaimed king of the swamp, which he has named Ebenezer, and he promptly crowns her queen. And so the 2 of them are interacting, and Bee is trying to figure out, does she know Tom? Does she have history with Tom? How did she get here? What's going on? There's kind of this foreboding threat that's happening, but she can't figure out what is going on. So there is just a lot of mystery and a lot of interest in that's happening. It feels very like Southern Gothic. It feels very descriptive. The prose is really, really lovely. So I highly recommend this one. I absolutely loved every second of reading it. I sat down and read it in one sitting, and I just found the writing to be just so, so gorgeous. And while it's a YA, it does not have the level of angst that you often find in YA novels that I really struggle with reading, and is the reason why I don't read very much YA, because I was a very angsty teen, like really angsty, and I just don't have desires to relive that. It just, I don't know. Plenty of people do, and if you don't mind YA angst, that's wonderful. I'm so glad for you, because there's a lot of books that I have trouble getting past that personally. So if that is not you, you are lucky. But this book, if that does bother you, this book doesn't have that, and it's really beautifully written. Highly recommend. Another book that I finished in that same reading vlog is Peace Like a River by Leif Enger. I'm shocked that this is a 5-star book, because this was on my Read a Rid project. It is a book that I picked up at a thrift store, having seen many people say that they loved it, and I had no idea what it was about, but I was just kind of like, oh, you know, got it for less than $1, so it was no big deal to pick it up. And then later I found out it was historical fiction. I was just kind of like, I don't always love historical fiction. I'm kind of picky about my historical fiction, and so I wasn't really motivated to pick it up. I'm so glad that I finally did. While this is technically historical fiction, the historical setting is not the point of the book at all. The point is the family. It's not like this is surrounding any sort of famous world event or national event at all. We are just following a small Midwestern family, I think in like the 60s or 70s, possibly the 50s, somewhere in that range. And we're following the Lance family, and there is a dad who is raising his 3 children alone, and he's a man of great faith, and miracles happen around him all the time. And this book is narrated by his middle child, his son Reuben, and he has asthma, and the way that he sees the world is very different than how his dad sees the world, very different than how his younger sister, Swede, sees the world. And she is incredibly imaginative. She is a writer who's obsessed with Westerns. So we get snippets of this epic poem that she is writing that's a Western throughout the story, and that's just a really fun addition. Towards the beginning of the book, Reuben's older brother makes a choice that gets him in trouble with the law, and he decides to run. And so we're following this family as they're processing everything that is going on, as they're trying to find him and all of those kinds of things. And it's just beautiful. It is so beautiful. And I loved the writing style, just felt very distinctive. It's very slow. It took me a long time to get into. Maybe that's not everyone's experience. But there's not a lot that happens at the very beginning of the book. It takes a while to kind of get into the actual story, but you really get to know this family beforehand. And I just loved it. I fell in love with this family, and the end of the book made me cry a lot. Just some very beautiful depictions of faith and family. So really recommend this. Continue on. I also completed Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This was his secret project #1, which I don't think that I have to obscure the title because it's out for the general public now. This is a book that I borrowed from my friend Whitney, who I read Warbreaker with. She had bought this book. She bought a copy of it for her daughter, and her daughter was in the middle of other books. And so I got to borrow it, and I was super excited. So thank you, Whitney and Savannah Grace, for loaning me Tress. I really enjoyed it. So Tress does take place in the Greater Cosmere, much like Warbreaker does, but it is separate from all of his other books in that it takes place on a different planet, different world, different magic system, all of that kind of stuff. But in this book, we follow a young girl named Tress, who is just a wonderful protagonist. I loved her so much, but kind of the idea of the story for Brandon Sanderson was he and his wife were watching The Princess Bride, and she said to him, what would have happened if Buttercup went after Westley instead of giving him up for dead and believing him lost? How would the story have looked different? And that was his jumping off point for Tress, is she falls in love with a boy who ends up leaving on a boat, and she refuses to just give him up for lost. She goes off in search of him. And she is just a wonderful, strong character, and I loved her so very much. I love the narration of this book so much. It is narrated by a character who plays a lot of guest roles in a lot of books and a more main role in the Stormlight Archive. And that's all I'm going to say, so that way I am not, giving up any spoilers here or anything, but he's a wonderful narrator, and I just love his voice. It sounds completely different than any other Brandon Sanderson book that I've read, because this character is someone who is very pithy and witty and also very insightful at times, and as a result the narrative voice sounds completely different than other Brandon Sanderson books that I have read, which I feel like really shows off Brandon Sanderson's writing chops, that it feels different than his other books tonally and the voice. So I really loved it. It made me laugh out loud so many times. There were so many quotes that just really struck me as beautiful or insightful, and then the story itself was just fun. It was very fun. It's very like pirate-esque, very adventurous. The magic system was interesting, fun, unique. I did feel like it got a little technical in some of the descriptions of the magic, just based on the tone of the book, which felt just a little bit out of place at times. There's one chapter in particular that felt that way. I didn't find the ends to be particularly mind-blowing. I saw it coming a million miles away, but I loved it. I just read it at the perfect time, I think, where it was exactly what I needed, something that was light and fun, and it was just lovely. I really enjoyed it. The last two books I'm going to talk about are both nonfictions, one of which is House of Dreams by Liz Rosenberg. This is a biography of Ellen Montgomery, which I read for Ellen Montgomery May, and I loved this book. This is actually my favorite book that I read for Ellen Montgomery May, even though it technically wasn't written by her. But there is so much in this book that is quoted from her, whether it be from her letters or from her journals or from her books itself or from interviews, whatever. There's so much of what she says that has been quoted here. And so it feels very much in her voice, which I just really loved. And it was really fun to see connections from her real life that then made appearances, whether they were identical or slightly changed for the better, in her stories, like Anne and Emily and some of her other books. And so that was just really, really wonderful. I will say that this is an incredibly sad story. Her life is very, very sad. There are moments of great beauty and moments of great loss. And overall, I would say that her life was very, very difficult. I will say also the illustrations at the beginning of the chapters of this book are just lovely. I loved them so much. And it says somewhere in this book that it is a young reader's biography of Ellen Montgomery, which I took to mean that it was going to be more middle grade, combined with that in the illustrations that are sprinkled throughout. But I would not say that this is a middle grade book. I would say this is more geared toward YA and above, because it does deal with some pretty heavy topics that maybe you do not want your children reading. There's a lot of discussion of mental illness, drug use, suicide, some kind of like sexual relationships and things. Nothing that's really gratuitous or super upsetting or descriptive, but just maybe something that you don't want to just hand off to a younger kid. Maybe upper end of middle grade might be fine with this, but that's just going to depend on your kid. But I just figured I'd throw that out there if this has been one you've been interested in for your child, because it says a young reader's biography. I would recommend this for older ages. And the last book that I read, guys, it's my favorite book of the year so far. Which, I don't know, I was going into this expecting to love it, and I more than loved it. So I think I'm gonna do a separate kind of like discussion / review video on this, so I'm gonna try not to go too in depth on it here. But that book is Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. The subtitle says A Reader's Guide to a More Tranquil Mind. And in this book, Alan Jacobs is kind of talking about the importance and the value of classics. Why do we need to read books that were written hundreds or thousands of years ago? What value do we see in them today? What do we do with the problematic things that run rampant in classic literature, such as racism, ableism, misogyny? We see all these things very, very vividly and even celebrated in classic literature at times. And so he kind of talks about, like, how do you reconcile the things that you get out of it, the connections that you make with the more problematic elements? How does having exposure to classics help root your thoughts on the past, help you make decisions in the present, and prepare for the future? And I loved this. As someone who loves classic literature, there's so much of this book that I'm like, yes, this is exactly how I feel. If people want to know why you should read classics, this tells you why. This is exactly how I feel, and I didn't know how to put it into words. And then there were sections that I'm like, I don't know how I think about that. I'm gonna have to ruminate on that a little bit, which really just goes with some of what he's saying as well, that, you know, you don't have to agree with everything someone says to kind of consider their point of view. And I can't remember if I've ever read any book in my life where I've taken so many notes, not to mention all these Post-its, many of which also have notes on them. So this book was deeply impactful and meaningful to me, and I am so glad that I read it, and I really recommend it to you, especially if you are someone who loves to read, but maybe you're not sure why it matters to read classic literature, or you love classic literature, or you love classic literature but you have difficulty with some of the more problematic elements in it. This little book is gold. I think it's like maybe 150 pages. Yeah. About 150 pages, but absolutely phenomenal. Well, those are the books that I read in May. Like I said, I had a marvelous reading month. Marvelous May. It's a nice little alliteration. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below if you have read any of these books before, what your thoughts were. What was your favorite book that you read in May? I hope that you had a really good reading month like I did. I hope you didn't have a meh May. Sounds very similar. Meh May. I hope that your May was marvelous as well. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.